Finally, Frostmourne hungers.
Wait till you see me in action.
Tread lightly. What is it now? Ah, at last. No one orders me around. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it. Speak, fool. No one orders me around. Speak, fool. Finally. Tread lightly. What is it now? Ah, at last. What is it now? Frostmourne hungers. Finally. Speak, fool. Ah, at last. Tread lightly. No one orders me around. This is more like it. Speak, fool. Frostmourne hungers. No one orders me around. Tread lightly. What is it now? Finally.
First blood.
At last. Frostmourne hungers. At last. Finally. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it. At last. Speak, fool. Tread lightly. Finally. Frostmourne hungers. At last. Finally. No one orders me around. This is more like it. Finally. At last. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it. At last. Finally. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it. At last. Frostmourne hungers. Finally. At last. What is it now? Frostmourne hungers. At last. Frostmourne. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it. Finally. Speak. This is more like it. No one orders me around. Frostmourne hungers. At last. Finally. Tread lightly. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it. At last. At last. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. At last. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it. Finally. At last. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it. At last. At last. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. What is it now? Tread lightly. Speak. Finally. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it. Finally. At last. Finally. At last. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it. This is more like it. At last. Finally. This is more like it. For the Lich King. No end. Finally. No one around. At last. Frostmourne hungers. At last. Finally. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. Finally. At last. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. At last. Finally. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. Tread lightly. last, finally. I'll ensure this. At last, this is more like it. Frostborn hungers, finally. Frostborn hungers, this is more like it. At last, this is more like it. What is it now? Speak, fool.
Our brethren's town is under attack.
Frostborn hungers, finally. At last. At last. This is Frostborn hungers. Frostborn hungers. At last. This is more like it. This is more like it. Frostborn hungers. At last. At last. Frostborn hungers.
Our brethren's town is under attack.
At last. This is more like it. Finally. Tread lightly. Finally. This is more like it. Frostborn hungers. At last. No one orders me. At last. Frostborn hungers. Tread lightly. What is it now? Finally, this is more like it. Frostborn hungers. At last. Frostborn hungers. At last. Speak, fool. This is more. No one orders me around. What is it? Frostborn hungers. This is more. At last. At last. This is more. Frostborn hungers. Finally. Frostborn hungers. Finally. At last. Faithless coward. This
Our brethren's town is under attack.
At last. Frostborn hungers. At last. This is more. Finally. Frostborn Tread lightly. Speak. Frostborn hungers. Finally. No one orders me. This is your page. At last. This is Frostborn hungers. Finally. At last. This is Frostborn hungers. At last. Finally. This is more like it. At last. Frostborn hungers. Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. At last. Finally. Finally. Tread lightly.
Our brethren's town is under attack.
This is more like it. At last. Finally. At last. This is at last. Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. Finally. Frostborn hungers. At last. Finally. This is more like it.
Our brethren's town is under attack.
At last. This is more like it. Finally. Frostborn hungers. At last. This is more like it. What is it now? No one orders me.
Our brethren's town is under attack.
Frostborn hungers. Finally. Tread lightly. At last. This is more like it. This is more like it. Finally. What is it now? At last. Frostborn hungers. At last. No end. Glory to the scourge. This is more like it. Frostborn. Last. Frostborn hungers.
Our brethren's town is under attack.
Around. This is more like it. Speak. This is more like it. At last. Frostborn. At last. This is more
Our brethren's town is under attack.
Frostborn hungers. At last. Finally. Speak. Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. This is more like it.
Our brethren's town is under attack.
At last. Frostborn hungers. Tread lightly. No one orders me around.
I wish only.
What is it? Finally. Tread lightly. At last. This is more like it. Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. At last. Frostborn hungers. At last. Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. At last. This is more like it. Frostborn hungers. At last. At last. Frostborn hungers.
Your pain.
This is more like it. At last. Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. At last. This is more like it. Frostborn hungers. No one is around. Finally.
I am ready.
Yes, my friend.
Speak, fool. What is it? At last. At last.
I'll make sure you suffer.
Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. At last. Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. At last. This is more like it. Finally. Tread lightly. No one orders me around. What is it now? At last. Speak, fool. Frostborn hungers. Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. At last. Finally. Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. At last. Finally. Tread lightly. No one orders me around. Frostborn hungers. At last. What is it now? Speak, fool. Speak, fool. This is more like it. This is more like it. Finally. Frostborn hungers.
Our brethren's town is under
At
attack.
last. At last. This is more like it. Frostborn hungers. At last. This is more like it. Frostborn hungers.
Double kill. Where shall my blood be spilled?
Tread lightly. No one orders me around. At last. What is it now? Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. No one orders me around. This is more like it. At last. Frostborn hungers. For the Lich King. At last. I'll get you. Frostmourne hungers.
Our brethren's town is under attack.
At last. Frostmourne hungers. This is no one around. Finally. Speak, fool. At last. Frostmourne hungers. Frostmourne hungers. At last. Speak, fool. Frostmourne hungers. What is it now? At last. This is what.
Our brethren's town is under attack.
Your pain. This is what. At last. Frostmourne hungers. What lich king? Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it. Tread lightly. Finally. At last. Your pain shall be. What is it? Tread lightly. This is more like it. Finally. At last. Frostmourne hungers. Finally. At last. This is more like it. Finally. Speak, fool. No one orders me around. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. At last. At last. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it. Finally. Faithless coward. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. Finally. At last. Finally. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. At last. What is it now? No one. Speak, fool. This is more like it. At last. Tread lightly. Frostmourne hungers. For the Lich King. Finally. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it. At last. Finally. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. No one orders me around. At last. Tread lightly. Finally. At last.
Greetings, my lord.
Speak. What is it? Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it. This is more like it. At last. Finally. Frostmourne hungers. What is it? Finally. No one ails me around. Speak, fool. Tread lightly. This is at last. Frostmourne hungers. This is at last. What is it now? Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. Finally. At last. At last. Speak, fool. This is more like it. Tread lightly. Frostmourne hungers. Finally. At last. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. Finally. At last. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. Frostmourne hungers. Finally. At last. This is more like it. Finally. At last. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. At last. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it.
Our forces are under attack.
Frostmourne hungers. Finally. At last. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it. This is more like it. At last. Frostmourne hungers. Frostmourne hungers. last, Frostborn hungers. No one orders me. At last, this is more like it. Finally. Frostborn hungers. Finally. Tread lightly. At last, this is more like it. Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. Frostborn hungers. Finally. At last, this is more like it. Frostborn hungers. Finally. Frostborn hungers. At last, this is more like it. Frostborn hungers. What is it? At last, this is finally. At last. Speak, fool. Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. At last. Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. Frostborn hungers. Finally. This is more like it. At last. At last. Finally. This is more like it. No one orders me around. Speak, fool. Frostborn hungers. At last. Frostborn hungers. At last, Frostborn hungers. Tread lightly. What is it now? No one orders me around. Tread lightly. At last. Speak. At last. This is more like it. Frostborn hungers. Finally. At last. This is more like it. Frostborn hungers. At last. Finally. This is Frostborn hungers. At last. This is more like it. Finally.
Unstoppable.
Frostborn hungers. What is it now? Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. Finally. At last. What is it now? For the Lich King. At last. This is more like it. Tread lightly. Speak, fool. Finally. Frostborn. This is more like it. Frostborn. At last, Frostborn hungers. No one orders me around. Finally. At last, this is more like it. Frostborn hungers. At last, this is more like it. Tread lightly. Finally. Frostborn hungers. At last. Speak, fool. Finally. This is more like it. At last. Finally. This is more like it. Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. Finally. Frostborn hungers. At last. This is more like it. Finally. Frostborn hungers. At last. Frostborn hungers. Finally. At last. What is it now? This is more like it. At last. This is more like it. Frostborn. No one orders me. Frostborn hungers. Speak, fool. Tread lightly. At last. This is more like it. Frostborn hungers. At last. Finally. This is more like it. Finally. Frostborn hungers. At last. This is more like it. This is more like it. Finally. At last. Frostborn hungers. Finally. This is more like it. Frostborn hungers. At last. At last. Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. This is more like it. At last. Frostborn hungers. At last. Finally. Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. Frostborn hungers. Finally. At last. This is more like it. At last. This is more like it. Frostborn hungers. Finally. This is more like it. At last. At last. This is more like it. Frostborn hungers. Finally. No one orders me around. At last. This is more like it. What is it now? Finally. What is it? Frostborn hungers. At last. Frostborn hungers. Finally. This is more like it. Speak, fool. This is more like it. Finally. At last. Frostborn hungers. Finally. No one orders me around. Frostborn hungers. At last. This is more like it. Finally. At last. Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. Finally. Frostborn hungers. At last. Frostborn hungers. Finally. This is more like it. At last. Frostborn hungers. Finally. This is more like it. Now, Frostborn. At last. Tread lightly. Tread lightly. This is more like it. At last. Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. No one orders me around. Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. Finally. At last. At last. Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. Frostborn hungers. At last. Finally. This is more like it. Finally. This is more like it. Speak, fool. Frostborn hungers. At last. What is it now? Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. At last. Finally. Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. At last. Finally. This is more like it. This is more like it. Finally. This is more like it.
Double kill.
Frostborn hungers. Speak, fool. No one orders me around. Finally. At last. Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. At last. Frostborn hungers. Finally. This is more like it. Frostborn hungers. Speak. This is more like it. At last, Frostmourne hungers. Finally, this is more like it. At last, Frostmourne hungers. At last, finally, this is more like it. Finally, at last, this is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. At last, Frostmourne hungers. Finally, this is more like it. At last, this is more like it. Finally, at last, Frostmourne hungers. What is it now?
My
What
life
is it
for
now?
Nazul.
Finally, this is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. At last. At last.
My life for Nazul. Speak, fool.
This is more like it. At last, Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it. At last. Frostmourne hungers. At last. Finally. No one orders me around. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. Tread lightly. At last. At last. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. At last. This is more like it. Finally.
Behind! Speak, fool.
Frostmourne hungers. At last. Frostmourne hungers. Finally. This is more like it. Finally. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it. Tread lightly. What is it now? No one orders me around. At last, tread lightly. No one orders me around. This is more like it. Finally. Speak, fool. At last. What is it now? Frostmourne hungers. Speak, fool. No one orders me around. This is more like it. What is it now? Tread lightly. Tread lightly. Frostmourne hungers. At last. Finally. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. Finally. At last. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. Speak, fool. Finally. What is it now? At last. At last. Frostmourne hungers. Finally. This is more like it. This is glory to the scourge. Frostmourne hungers. At last. This is Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it. Finally. Frostmourne hungers. No one will. At last. Finally. Frostmourne hungers. At last. This is more like it. Frostmourne. At last. This is more like it. Finally. This is more like it. For the Lich King. Finally. Frostmourne hungers. At last. Frostmourne hungers. Finally. This is more like it. At last. Frostmourne hungers. Finally. At last. This is more like it. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. Finally. At last. Unstoppable. At last, Frostmourne hungers. Tread lightly. This is more like it. Frostborn hungers. This is at last. Frostborn hungers. This is at last. At last. This is more like it. Frostborn hungers. Finally. At last. Speak, fool. At last. This is more like it. Finally. Frostborn hungers.
Our brethren's town is under attack.
Frostborn hungers. At last. Finally. Frostborn hungers. At last. This is more like it. Finally. At last. Finally. This is more like it. Frostborn hungers. This is at last. No one orders me around. Frostborn hungers. Frostborn hungers. What is it now? This is more like it. At last. At last.
I'll do what I must.
Speak, fool. No one orders me around. Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. Finally. At last.
Your pain shall be met.
Frostborn. At last. This is Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. At last. At last. This is more like it. Frostborn hungers.
Your pain shall be legendary. For the Lich King. Glory to the Scourge. Our brethren's town is under attack.
Finally. This is more like it. Frostborn hungers. Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. Finally. At last. What is it now?
Our
No one
brethren's
orders
town
me
is under
around.
attack.
Speak, fool. Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. Tread lightly. What is it now? Tread lightly. Speak, fool. Finally. No one orders me around. Speak. At last. Frostborn hungers. Tread lightly. This is more like it. This is more like it. No one will. Finally. Speak, fool. Frostborn hungers. No one orders me around. At last. What is it now? Finally. Tread lightly. Speak, fool. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. Ah, at last. Finally. Frostmourne hungers. At last.
Monster kill!
What is it now? Tread lightly. Finally. At last. Finally. At last. This is more like it. At last. Finally. You will know endless. No one orders me around. Frostmourne hunger. Tread lightly. At last. This is more like it. Finally. Now, this is at last. Frostmourne hungers. At last. At last. Your pain. Frostmourne hungers. For the Lich King.
Our brethren's town is under attack.
At last.
Double kill!
Finally. Frostmourne hunger. At last. This is one.
Our brethren's town is under attack.
Frostmourne hungers.
Killing spree!
No one orders me around. No one orders me around. Tread lightly. What is it? Speak. What is it? Tread lightly. Speak. Frostmourne hungers. Finally. At last. This is more like it. last, this is